I'm located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples. Please think about the traditional lands you are currently situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. The ongoing work to make the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country, should inform our discussions in this resource spotlight and beyond. Welcome, everyone. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of our teams, I would like to welcome everyone to our resource spotlight, Youth Dating Violence, 2 innovative Canadian interventions. We're delighted to welcome Wesley Weibridge and Lee Fraser, representatives from Egale, Canada's Speak Out LGBTQI2S Youth Dating Violence Project. We're also welcoming Kelsey Harford and Ben Tiscow, representatives from Radius Youth Dating Violence Intervention Program, Intensive Intervention Program. Throughout the session, we are pleased to have Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service providing interpretation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Wesley Weibridge.
Hello, and before I begin, I just wanted to note that I am joining this call from Toronto and acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also wanted to acknowledge that Takaranto is covered by the Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And I'm going to pass it to Lee Fraser to do a land acknowledgement as well.
So I'm in Winnipeg, settled within, working and living on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I respect the treaties that were made on these territories. I respect Indigenous collective sovereignty where no treaties were made, and acknowledge the extensive disruption, duress, and trauma imposed by colonial warfare, both past and ongoing.
And with that, we will begin. So this is Speak Out, a gender-based violence research and intervention project. We started this project in April 2019, and it was ongoing until March 2023. So Egale is Canada's national LGBTQI2S or 2S LGBTQI organization for more than 30 years. Egale has been working to improve the lives of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and two-spirit individuals across Canada and to enhance the global response to 2S LGBTQI issues. So today's agenda will be going through the project background, highlighting some survey insights. We'll be speaking about our hackathon. We'll be speaking about the next steps. And then towards the end of today's session, after our other speakers, we will be doing a Q&A. So I will introduce myself. I'm Wesley Weibridge. I am the project management officer at Egale. My portfolio centers on our legal and gender-based violent projects. And I will pass it to Lee Fraser so that they can get to know all of you a little bit better and you can get to know them.
Hi, so I'm Lee Fraser, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba, and I am the research lead on Egale's Speak Out program. So While my involvement is primarily in the research phase, I'm going to take you through a brief description of the overall project, which we're in the middle of now. So during this 5-year program, Egale has distributed a national survey exploring the experiences of 2S LGBTQI youth in Canada, and then hosted a hackathon that was supported by the survey data, so the contributions of youth in terms of the dating experiences that they have and violence that they have faced. And so that informed the hackathon to explore the support options and the programming that younger people in the 2S LGBTQIA community would like to see. So from the hackathon, the winning ideas are in the process of being designed and implemented alongside an advisory committee to serve in a pilot with 5 service agencies. So to tell you a little bit about the background of the research, in the project so far, we used Qualtrics survey platform, which some of you might be familiar with. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we navigated risk at each stage of the project here, because of the fact that, of course, working with youth is a marginalized group at the best of times. And in this project, we were not only working with the subgroup of 2S LGBTQI youth, so sexual and gender minorities, but also we were specifically doing outreach and grassroots contact to ensure that we recruited youth from areas where we don't often see as much participation, so from groups which are commonly underrepresented in research, in particular, for example, transgender, non-binary, and two-spirit youth, who are often subject to more violence than youth who are in other membership in the 2S LGBTQI community. So we chose Qualtrics because there was options for data to be stored securely and up to Canadian standards, as opposed to the standards of another country, when often you're using a program that stores data elsewhere. And we targeted our recruitment to not only trans, non-binary, and two-spirit youth, but also, for example, youth in care, youth living with disabilities, people who are working within communities where they might have contact with youth who are, for example, street involved. So not just underrepresented groups, but also groups, for example, that previous research had showed would be more likely to be subject to dating violence and less likely to access resources. So it was important to us to hear from those groups. And also in terms of the ethics in putting forward research of this kind, it was important to us to ensure that we got as much representation as possible so that we would be able to make good use of the data and put forward practical ideas to support youth, because that is our ethical responsibility when they are taking the risk of completing something which may be difficult for them under circumstances living at home or in an unsupportive environment. So in measuring different forms of dating violence that youth might experience, we used accessible and non-threatening phrasing to mitigate not only the potential emotional impact of the survey, so we tried to avoid language that might be triggering, but also, though in academic work and community service work, we often don't shy away from the unpleasant terms, for example, for things like sexual violence. It's been shown in previous research that, especially if we are talking about an intimate partner, that youth and other groups as well may not be as willing to disclose that something has happened if it is not termed in ways that are, say, more specific to an action or experience and more comfortable for them to choose than terms that are more explicitly associated with sexual violence, something that they may not be willing to admit someone close to them has done. So we wanted to make it as comfortable and easy as possible for youth to accurately give us information about their experiences. So we also navigated the risks that youth would face in allowing every survey page to have a link to leave the program. So in our study, we know that we are asking about dating violence, which is something that if someone is in a precarious situation, they may not want a partner or other person to see out of the fear that there would be consequences in their life. So we have a navigation away from the page for that reason that would take them to a neutral site, to Google. So something that is not associated with the content of the survey. And that was available on every page of the survey. And it's also there because we are looking at 2S LGBTQI youth. And so within our sample, a large proportion of them are underage, are living with parents, are dependent on someone else. And they may or may not be out about their gender, about their sexual orientation with the people in their home environment. And it also may not be safe for that to be disclosed to those around them. So that was another reason it was very important to us that, for example, we didn't provide opportunities to navigate to Egale's page because Egale is explicitly a 2S LGBTQI organization. So we also provided it for personal devices. So Qualtrics is set up to be available on things like an iPhone. So we made sure that it was accessible and doable from something like that or an iPad so that there was more potential for privacy. It's something that is easier to hide, as well as can be carried to, say, a public location where Wi-Fi is available. However, in this and other areas, we do acknowledge some limitations because of the fact that with the pandemic going on for most of our data collection, some of the publicly available computers, such as in libraries and services like that, might not have been available. So we do know that we weren't able to necessarily reach all the people we would have hoped to. So we also provided, of course, resources for youth to go to if they felt unsafe, if they were facing dating violence currently rather than in the past. And as I mentioned before, we prioritized making full use of the data to ensure that the risks that youth may have taken to share their experiences with us were not in vain. So we have a responsibility as well to ensure that all of the feedback they gave us is disseminated as widely as possible. And so for that reason, I also want to thank all of you for being here today, because that helps us to respect the experiences of the youth and to share that with all of you. So to give you some of the outcomes of our survey, and I will suggest that if you have a particular interest, you keep an eye out for the full report because we were able to measure quite a wide variety of data. So of those youth who experienced dating violence, we did look at specifically how they accessed supports, what kind of supports they wanted, where they wanted to find information about it. So more than half of youth who experienced dating violence said they would they sought help 1 month or less after it occurred. Well, 16% waited a year or more. 29% of their remaining youth had sought help within 6 months. However, as we will look at in a few slides here, the type of help that they wanted may or may not have been what we would expect, or in addition, some of the statistics that we measured that I won't be able to share with you today because it would take hours to share, showed that youth didn't always get the help that they wanted when they asked for it, or they didn't find it useful. So that's one of the important outcomes of this project, is ensuring that the information they've given us is translated into something that they will find useful. So unsurprisingly, many youth wanted information about dating violence online. And so for this question, as for others, youth could choose more than one choice. So of all of the youth who participated, a little over half also chose community locations, such as a flyer at a doctor's office. 45% indicated drop-in centers. And then collectively, text, emails, or in-person information were also listed as places that youth would like to go to find information about dating violence support. We did want to highlight that only 17% wanted to find information from an authority like a police officer. Now, there may be reasons for this. So that might mean, for example, that it would make the situation too serious or acknowledge too much of what the youth has gone through to speak to someone in an official position of authority such as that. However, it is interesting to note that this statistic means that 83% of youth did not indicate they would go to a police officer to find information on how to deal with dating violence. And part of that we have to acknowledge could be from the long and difficult history that the police forces in Canada have had with the 2S LGBTQI community, and the fact that certain authorities Police among them, as well as many other organizations, may or may not have the trust of youth in the way that we hope that they do. So in terms of the services that youth really wanted to see, more than half of them said they wanted one-on-one counseling, so 79%. And so that was a very positive outcome in the sense that one-on-one counseling, as long as the counselor is a good fit, is something that's consistently shown to help with, say, the emotional outcomes of experiencing something like dating violence. There was also an interest in testing for sexually transmitted infections from 68% of youth, or a safe space for the night from 67% of them. So many of them indicated, that their needs would range across healthcare, across shelter, across counseling. However, it was worth highlighting as well that almost half of them said they would like housing or homelessness resources. Now, because most of the youth in our survey did live at home with their parents, and most of them were under 18, it was interesting that so many were interested in homelessness resources, and it suggested to us that they may feel that their position in their home is not stable. Whether or not they are out, they may feel that their position in the family is precarious and that they could be ejected. So most youth did say they wanted to receive help from other 2S LGBTQI people, but only 36% did. So this is unfortunate, and it could indicate that it's harder to hire 2S LGBTQI people, or also that service providers need to make more of an effort to indicate that those people are available, which can be difficult as well to avoid compromising the privacy of people who are providing the services. Now, finally, when youth did seek help, the largest proportion, so 29% of people who said they sought help had reached out to a friend or chosen family member. A smaller proportion said a school counselor, and vanishingly small proportions of 4% or less chose options like parents or physicians. And that is a little bit more worrisome when we think about the fact that a physician or community service provider could be relative strangers to youth, versus the fact that clearly there are many youth who might not feel comfortable going to their parents for assistance. So I'm going to pass this back to Wes to talk about some more of the project's progression.
So hello. I am now going to be speaking about the next phase after our initial research. So after the initial research, we moved on to the hackathon phase of the program, where Lee Cameron and myself and the Egale team were at the helm. We attended in-person hackathons pre-pandemic and did lots of research on ideation events and how to run them. But when the pandemic hit, we had to make a clear decision to switch to an online format, and chose, after an environmental scan, a whiteboard technology called Mural, which I'll be going into greater detail in a few minutes. So to learn about this technology itself, we attended workshops, webinars, and co-working events, and spoke to the Mural team on creating a live event. They also had interactive webinar events where you could take part and be part of these collaborative events. So we created templates from sourcing several pre-existing templates on the Mural platform, and edited down what we thought we would need, along with some of our own resources. So for outreach, I just wanted to note that for our participants, we did use targeted ads, but we also focused heavily on grassroots outreach to 2S LGBTQI youth and traditionally unrepresented youth to create snowball sampling in our outreach. I also want to make note that the hackathon idea itself was created out of recommendations and contributions from the community. Once the participants were chosen, we delivered a email participant handbook to all members of the event. This handbook had data from the survey, tips and tricks for Mural, login information, the agendas, etc., and all useful information to get the participants started. We had over 50 people sign up. We had more than 25 come to the event, which is not bad for an online event during the pandemic. We personally would have liked to see more. All 50 would have been great, but I think a challenge that many organizations and folks who are doing online events is, how do you engage with your audience pre-event? So an idea that came up to combat this was one-on-one interviews with the folks who applied. though this plays into safety, and we're limited ethically around how to justify those interviews. Another idea that's came up is an idea of building welcome packages with treats, snacks, supplies to make everyone feel a bit more part of something bigger during this time of social isolation. And then at the hackathon itself, we had judges from several nonprofit organizations that were part of the judging ceremony and also stayed with us over the course of 4 days to assist in development, to help run workshops, and to drop into breakout rooms to kind of give assistance where needed and also give some lived experience into the creation of these models that folks were building. So we had Debbie Awasu Akeyia from the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. We had Jamie Sampa and Rebecca Hooten from the 519 here in Toronto, Victoria Bell from Dandelion Initiative, and Michael Adia, who is a registered social worker from St. Michael's Hospital. And Lee Cameron and myself facilitated with the Egale team acting as navigators and cheerleaders in each breakout room, assisting with team development and making sure everyone was safe and feeling all right. So the participants were teams built up of community members, adults and youth, 2S LGBTQI youth, service providers, and allies. We tried to match up an equal number of youth and adults so that there was some sort of mentorship in each group. And then the first day of programming focused on trauma-informed approach and accessible programming. In the design of it, we wanted to work on to create an accessible program for all. So we met with web developers and our tech team to speak about AODA standards and web accessibility. We worked with our comms team to pick proper text and colors, spoke to our learning team about digital learning and digital engagement to find out how to make this experience that felt safe and inclusive, fun, and yet enjoyable. We wanted to think really about the participant and learner experience. Once the template was finished, we tested it with our staff, including learners with no previous experience in products such as this. This was integral. They showed us holes in our design and our facilitation and made us only realize how teaching through or facilitating through something that is this kind of whiteboard technology needs repetitive instructions. And then on the delivery and execution, I just want to note a little bit more about the trauma-informed approach. We did have an active listener that was just a click away and a tech hackathon help desk if there was any tech issues. We brought in experts, as I said, to kind of speak about their experience in gender-based violence work, as well as giving Jamie Sampa from the 519 did a wonderful workshop on trauma as well. We really wanted to balance speaking about these tough issues without it letting it be the main focus of the hackathon. We did give trigger warnings, and we really brought up the ability to drop in or out, drop off mic, drop off camera. If you go grab a glass of water or a bite to eat, mute the whole presentation or the whole hackathon if needed, so that folks really kind of felt safe to be in this space. And then we trained our navigators or cheerleaders with a full booklet of go-to emergency numbers and what ifs, and kind of de-escalation of arguments, etc. We also met with our cheerleaders to run through each day's activities, and we had a checkout after each day as well to make sure that every team and every participant was doing all right. This was a 4-day event, so to have 25 people stay with us for 4 days, I think is quite an achievement during this time of digital fatigue. So just a few other challenges. Obviously, technology, as we all know, is a part where we, internet connectivity, as well as it being not available to folks who didn't have internet, was definitely a challenge. The timeline of a quick delivery of idea generation was also a challenge, being that the first day of our presentation, or our hackathon, sorry, was devoted probably around 75% to just getting folks comfortable and working through activities together so that they felt that they could create on this platform. There was really only 2.5 days of development on the intervention ideas. So the timeline was definitely a challenge. I think more timing in general in training of staff and more time in general for training of the program product and the hackathon itself. A lot of these recommendations came out of, we had a debrief with our participants to speak openly about how to navigate these gaps and create better hackathon-like events in the future. So technology and digital engagement gives us so many opportunities for learners to learn, but it also gives the freedom for them, these learners, to leave. This user experience of those dropping in and out is something that I think I personally want to work on, and just how to frame the idea of how do you frame the expectation on the learner to be positively dependent on another. So that was the one issue we also had, was just around youth dropping out and being able to come back in and feeling a bit lost and slowing their team down. So we wanted to give them roles of note takers or other roles that can kind of move it along without slowing down the process. And then pros, I really want to note that this was, as I said, a 4-day event. We had over 25 people show up for all of those days. It really was a place where folks felt that they could mess up and fail and feel safe to learn and coexist and collaborate with others. Many youth reached out to us saying that this space felt safe and welcoming and felt very far from just another Zoom room. So I would say that this is a huge success, especially, as I said before, with the amount of digital fatigue. So just a little bit more about Mural. Remote working and the pandemic has pushed us obviously to engaging in more collaborative work in digital platforms. We chose Mural to facilitate this. Like Google Jamboard, Mural is an online digital whiteboard technology. It's usually used for brainstorming and ideation, project management, event workflows, research and design, strategy and planning, and obviously presentations, mapping, and remote meetings and hackathons and games. So as I mentioned, we spent the first day with facilitating activities for participants to learn and play with us on the platform to get comfortable. The event had workshops on trauma, which I mentioned, and accessible programming. We had dance parties, games, in-kind prizes from several sponsors. We had an active listener if folks felt triggered. And we really tried our best to make it a safe, inclusive, fun online digital space. But as previously mentioned, these EDs from gender-based violence organizations dropped in and out and really did help along with this feeling of comfortability. And then over the course of the 3 afternoons, the team worked hard on idea generation, and on the last afternoon built a presentation, resulting in the last day being a ceremony with the winning team's idea being selected. So the winning team's brainstorm was a youth-led consent program that bridges education, the arts, and community building. And I'm just going to pass it on to Lee to just say a bit more about that winning idea.
So the winning idea really evolved from the insights, and the intervention will focus on building consent culture through a collaborative art therapy lens presented as a digital zine. So the youth chose the name Building Community Understanding Consent, 2S LGBTQ+ Youth Collaborative Zine Program. The next step is refining and building the pilot, but this is going to be a youth-led decolonial approach, and the priorities are that it be accessible. They also wanted to prioritize safety and anonymity, which naturally around navigating situations of consent and possible dating violence is very important, especially for younger people. And of course, bodily autonomy and building community as well. So making those connections is something that I think draws on some of that vintage idea of an art zine, and putting that into a digital landscape right now allows people to connect and build skills in addition to creating awareness about consent in their communities. And I'll pass that back to Wes now.
And I just want to make sure that you can see me. All right, my camera is working. Just lastly, I wanted to note that now we're on to the next phase, which is during this phase, we are putting together our Intervention Action Committee. So this 2S LGBTQI Intervention Action Committee will be working with us to assist in the logistics, the planning and delivery of our program resources, site-specific training, and evaluation models toward the successful trial of this program. And we'll also be helping to write the report that will be accessible to other agencies and organizations across the country. So with that, join the intervention committee, get involved. We're actively recruiting members. So the Action Committee recruitment window is now through May 22nd, 2021, with our kickoff meeting starting the first week of June. Your slides today should have an active link attached. If not, please let me know and I will add those to the chat. And then I just wanted to note that we also have a classroom support worker case manager position at Egale that we're hiring right now. So if you want to click on that link, you can find more information. That role is also up on Charity Village. And that's for our day treatment program for 6 to 8 students here in Toronto. It would be on-site and remote. So yeah, but that is pretty much where we are with this phase. So honestly, we are looking for about 10 to 14 members for this committee. We'd love you to take part. So I will drop that into the chat following this presentation. Thank you. And that concludes our part today.
Okay, we're going to move over to Benta and Kelsey. Benta, you're muted.
Not a great start for the afternoon with the muting. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll try again. My name is Benta Scott. I'm the clinical director at Radius Child and Youth Services. Thank you so much for having us. I'm glad I'm unmuted. This afternoon, I'm going to be speaking a little bit about our Youth Dating Violence intensive intervention program, as well as some of the other work that we do at Radius, and Kelsey will be providing some of the details around the intervention program specifically.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelsey. As Benta mentioned, I am a clinical therapist at Radius and the program coordinator of the Youth Dating Violence Intensive Intervention Program.
So our agenda is pretty optimistic, I think, to get all that covered this afternoon. We'll try and be quick as we go through it, but we did want to speak a little bit about the program and the work we do. At Radius, it's a fairly new organization because it's the amalgamation of 2 formerly existing organizations, the Halton Trauma Center and the safety program that was run out of Thistletown in Toronto. Currently at Radius, we work with populations with children, youth, and families where the children have experienced some form of interpersonal violence, quite often sexual abuse. We also work with kids under the age of 12 who are engaging in problematic sexual behavior, as well as youth who've committed a sexual offense or sexual harm. And we do a lot of work with sibling sexual abuse and then working with families to repair those relationships after the work has been done. I'm going to speak for a moment a little bit about some of the work we do specifically about youth who sexually harm, because it ties very much to the youth dating violence program as well, because many of the dating violence activities, in fact, are sexual in nature. What we know about young people who commit sexual offenses is that we've known for a long time that they're responsible for a great deal of the child sexual abuse that's perpetrated. And there's been a very interesting study that came out in 2019 that indicated that, in fact, it's not just a lot of sexual abuse that's perpetrated by this group, but in fact, 77% of boys that are sexually abused, their perpetrator is a child or an adolescent, and for girls, that's 70% of all child sexual abuse. So that's a pretty big number. And what we know, one of our colleagues, Dr. Tracy Kerwin, has done some very interesting research, in fact, that demonstrates that regardless of the perpetrator being an adult or an adolescent or even an under 12, that the impact of the abuse is the same. So, some people are inclined to sort of dismiss it as inconsequential if it's a child under 12 who's engaging in sexual harm with another child, but the impact on that other child can be pretty significant. The other piece is we've had some pretty good success with our work and treatment work in this program. Overall, for young people that commit sexual offenses, the recidivism rate, if they get no treatment at all, isn't particularly high compared to other activities. It's about 15 to 20% is what the rough estimates are. In our program, there's been some research that's been done that looks at comparing youth who have engaged in treatment compared to a comparison group who have not engaged in treatment. And now we're talking about young people who have committed a sexual offense in both groups. And those in the treatment group, there was a 5% recidivism versus 18% in the treatment group. And that was after 10 years, so post-treatment after 10 years. They also looked at this same sample for 20 years after treatment. And you can again see that those treatment impacts are lasting. So we're looking at 9% of recidivism versus 21%. Now, those differences aren't huge, but what is important to note is that if you think about the difference between 5 and 18%, well, that's 13%, but that's 13 people who are not now being sexually abused that otherwise may have been. So that makes it kind of impactful in that way. I want to speak briefly too about our approach to the work and our philosophy as we work with these young people. One of the things that we really take seriously is this idea around not overly asking for accountability and responsibility at the front end. Of course, people have to take responsibility for the harm they do, but historically in the treatment of young people who have committed sexual offenses, it was very much a shame-based model where people were put on the hot seat and were made to feel bad about themselves. That's not helpful for eliciting change. So while we invite people into a space where they can eventually take responsibility, we also acknowledge that many times no one has taken responsibility for the harms that have been done to them in their lives. And that's where we sort of take a more proactive approach. And we do that by including a trauma-based assessment in our assessments. We also think about the person as a whole. So we want to move beyond just eliminating the criminogenic factors that might cause someone to offend again. We look at all elements of their life. So if they're struggling with depression or anxiety or self-esteem issues, some of those are in fact predictors, but some are not. But we want to take care of the whole person. The last thing I really want to talk about is we recognize that these kids that make these choices to hurt others don't get there in a vacuum. They live in a culture, in a world that sends a lot of messages that support violence, that support sexual violence. And so I've included just a little piece from Alan Jenkins' work here and this really sort of exemplifies our approach to the work, which is we respect the other's capacity for thought and action, which is sometimes complicit with and at times resistant to dominant cultural interests and power relations. So with the young people that we work with, we take the time to sort of deconstruct some of those messages that support sexual violence. I'm going to just hand it over to Kelsey in a minute, who's going to talk more specifically about the dating violence program. But I want to talk a little bit about how it started. So about 15 years ago, I was attending a conference in California. And they were giving the results of the PAR program, which is the adult program to treat men who have been violent with their partners, primarily men. And they were looking at the outcomes, and they weren't good in California. They were really quite abysmal, and they were looking to sort of abolish that whole system, in fact, there. And it got me thinking about, well, what's out there for young people who are being violent with their dating partners? Or what happens, what about these men when they're in their teens? Is there a place for intervention then? And I was talking about it in one of the courses I teach at York University. And one of the grad students there did her whole master's sort of thesis on looking at the resources for interventions for this group. And she sort of surveyed all of North America, what was available. And there really wasn't a lot of, that intervention after the fact. So there's lots of great prevention programs. But once somebody's already engaged in violence with a partner, there really wasn't anything there. And that's what really prompted us to apply for some funding to get this program started. I'll pass it on to Kelsey.
Thanks, Benta. And just to give a little bit of background information, some statistics around why, to add to Benta's point around why we wanted to do this program. Research has shown that 43% of dating violence occurs between young people ages 15 to 24. And as I'm going to get into the program that we are talking about today, we accept clients ages 12 to 24. So we cover that whole age range where we're seeing almost half of all dating violence occurring. Additionally, 28% of high school students have been victims of dating violence. And 1/3 of all incidents of violence within romantic relationships are not reported. So there's a large amount of violence that is still occurring that we don't have information on. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but there are a large number of negative impacts of dating violence or interpersonal violence on the survivors that include mental health impacts, potential physical health impacts, chronic ongoing health issues, and potentially death. And numerous studies have suggested that without intervention, youth who are using dating violence are more likely to continue using violence in adulthood against their future partners. So this is why it's really important that we are intervening when they're young. As Benta mentioned, there was an application for some funding to launch this program. And so through the support of Public Safety Canada, Radius has been able to pilot this new program. And I forgot to change the age on this slide. We only just recently got approval to extend our upper age limit up to 24. So we can accept young people into the program ages 12 to 24. I'm going to briefly go over some of the risk factors. So we did a very thorough investigation and literature review, and we came up with the following risk factors. And if you'd like any specific references for the risk factors, please feel free to email us. We can absolutely forward those. So dynamic and dyadic risk factors included background risk factors such as individual psychopathology, any immediate situational risk factors like stress level, and relational risk factors like relationship satisfaction. And risk factors may be partially relationship specific and higher risk at some times than at other times. And there's a continuity in violence within a specific relationship, but not across relationships. So some of the relational risk factors in particular include negative interactions, relationship satisfaction, and so that's looking at bullying and satisfaction within the dating relationship, as well as jealousy, and we're starting to see a lot of information coming out around the use of technology and how that plays a role with jealousy as well. Some of the contextual risk factors that we came across include living in urban neighborhoods and experiencing community violence, single parent homes. So specifically, males may carry the notion of female household dominance into their own dating relationships. Parental psychopathology, for example, alcohol problems, antisocial behavior, and depressive symptoms can create a hostile and conflictual family environment that contributes to and maintains externalizing behavior from early childhood into early adolescence. Negative parent-child relationships can play a role. Research showed that retrospective reports of parent-child relationship quality and dating violence perpetration or membership in reciprocal aggressive violent relationships occurred. Family and parental conflict was another factor. The young person witnessing domestic violence within their home. And then also harsh parenting, which again tended to lead towards externalizing behavior or maladaptive coping. Some of the individual risk factors include aggressive behaviors. They're the externalizing behaviors that I just mentioned, low self-esteem, bullying, stressful life events for males specifically, substance use, in particular alcohol, mental health, friends having a peer group who engage in dating violence, having deviant or antisocial peers, peer group aggression, the young people having beliefs that support aggression, as well as poor academic achievement. And another individual risk factor includes the subscription to gender norms. So gender-typed social scripts that emphasize male power and prescribe that men should be tough and aggressive, emotionally disengaged, and have sexual prerogative in romantic relationships. So boys who endorse traditional gender roles may encode and retrieve gender-typed social scripts that emphasize male power and prescribe that men should be tough and aggressive. Men and boys draw on these scripts to guide their social interactions with romantic partners, and these folks may be at increased risk for perpetrating dating violence as a means of enacting power within their relationships. In addition, men and boys who endorse traditional gender role attitudes may tend to view romantic relationships through a combative lens in which women are seen as attempting to turn the tables by controlling men. And the degree to which boys who endorse these scripts actually retrieve and enact them as aggressive behaviors toward dating partners, however, may depend on one's injunctive normative beliefs as to whether such behaviors are acceptable or not acceptable. Okay, so I just went over a whole bunch of the risk factors. So factors that potentially put someone at higher risk to perpetrate violence. And through our literature review, we also came across a number of protective factors. So things that would help a young person to not potentially be engaging in the dating violence. So closeness to a parent or parental warmth is one of those factors. Parental monitoring. So for example, increased parental monitoring tended to result in less externalizing behaviors and consequently less domestic violence or dating violence. Having pro-social peers, having some good self-regulation skills and emotional intelligence, as well as empathy, all qualified as protective factors. Okay. And now to get into a little bit more of our program specifically. So Benta already talked about how we work with young people who have engaged in sexual offenses. And so this process of intake and assessment goes the same for all of our clients. So once the young person goes through intake, they come in and do an intensive assessment. So as you can see on this slide here, the assessments can take 6 to 10 clinical hours. It is quite lengthy, but we look at everything from trying to look at those protective factors and the risk factors, where the young person's strengths lie, and what we really need to address in treatment. And this assessment results in a report that then guides our treatment process. And once the young person moves into treatment, it's weekly 1-hour sessions with an assigned therapist. Something that's really unique about our program is that it's not time limited. And so we'll work with the young person until their treatment goals have been completed. So they're not coming in and getting a set 6 sessions, for example. It's not uncommon for us to work with young people for 1 year to 2 years. So we really get to dig into some of what they've had going on in their life. And as mentioned, we do work from a trauma-informed approach. So we recognize that for many of these young people who are engaging in dating violence tend to have a trauma history of their own. And so we're going to be mindful of that and also work on that through their therapy. We have an eclectic team of therapists at Radius, and we use a variety of treatment modalities, as you can see on screen. Eventually, we would like to run some groups. COVID has kind of put a little bit of a slowdown on this, but eventually we will be running some groups. These groups would be a skills-based format, and we'd be going over such things as conflict management, how to handle rejection, taking accountability, and looking at restorative justice and healing, as well as several other topics. As Benta mentioned, no program like this exists. So research is a big part of what we're trying to do so that we can disseminate this information and help other people create similar programs. So we will be doing longitudinal research. Once participants have completed the program, there will be check-ins at 1 year and between 6 months to 1 year after completion to examine the program efficacy. And these check-ins would be supported with CPIC data to follow up on the recidivism. And this is all with the young person's consent. We're not going to be checking or following up if they don't consent. And we want to get some program evaluation data that will help identify if the youth actually benefited from the program or not, or what we need to change so that they can benefit more. I'm going to pass it over to Benta again for a moment.
I saw briefly in the chat that there was a question about who this is for, and it's for any youth 12 to 24 who's volunteering to come forward and do some work on this issue. I want to talk briefly because we're just at the beginning stages of our program, and so it's sort of our pilot year where we're getting our first youth into assessment. And just some of our early impressions so far is that what we're seeing in terms of referrals is that they tend to be older. We're hypothesizing about that these are youth who are sort of in their first real serious romantic relationship and things have started to go wrong. Other impressions or early impressions is that the types of violence we're seeing are really quite diverse. So we weren't sure what was going to get referred. We thought, is it going to be people name calling, which is serious, but and needs attention and redirection, but not sure is a good match for such an intensive kind of program. But what we're really seeing is it's quite broad. We've had things like stalking, harassment, sexual violence. We've had, of course, physical violence, hitting and punching, violence directed at a pregnant partner. So it's been quite broad. The other surprising thing so far is, I guess we sort of had an expectation around the adherence to traditional gender roles that would be quite pronounced. And what we're seeing so far is that it's in there, but in a much more overt form. So it's not sitting sort of right on the surface where it's saying, oh yeah, women should be at home in the kitchen and having babies. But it's more subtle in it's taking more the shape of, I know what's better in a relationship, or she was being over emotional and didn't get it. So that kind of more subtle kinds of sexism or adherence to those traditional gender roles.
Thanks, Benta. And now I think this will probably, answer the questions. I've seen some questions coming up about who can apply for the program. So I don't know why this slide is looking all weird, but anyway, so as far as referral information, referrals can come from essentially anywhere. They can come from the young person themselves. It can be a self-referral or from family or partner. We're primarily getting referrals from youth justice, like probation officers, but they can also come from school social workers, CAS, etc. And we really put in a lot of work to try and make sure that this program was accessible to anyone. So we do have some funding available for TTC tickets or Uber rides if necessary, although most of our services are being done virtually at this point due to COVID. We have translation services available. If there is a need for the young person to be seen in person, they can be seen at either our Etobicoke or our Oakville site. But otherwise, we're able to service young people across Ontario virtually. It's been a benefit of, if you can, find any sort of benefit in COVID, it's the fact that we were able to expand this program province-wide. So again, the referral criteria, the young person needs to be between the ages of 12 and 24. They don't need to be charged with a crime. However, their actions need to be able to be considered a criminal offense. So often, as we know, police don't always necessarily get involved, or charges aren't always laid when they are involved, but that young person can still access our services. And then the final piece is that participation has to be voluntary on the part of the client. And that is our brief summary slide. I apologize if you can hear my dog barking in the background. It's the nature of work from home. So this is a summary of our referral information. And again, I believe everyone has been sent out the slides. And so that is it for our program. And I think now the wonderful facilitators are going to take back over and navigate some of these questions that have come up.
Yes, thank you, Kelsey. What wonderful presentations. I'm going to call on my colleague, Diane Lalonde, to join me. And there are so many rich questions that what I'm going to propose is that Diane will present questions to Benta and Kelsey, and I'll present questions to Wesley and Lee so that we can think about what we're going to ask next and focus in those two areas, Diane and myself. And what I'd also like to say is that this resource spotlight, we extended the time till 2:15, but we also realized that some people have already shared that it was such a wonderful presentation, but they had to go on to other commitments. We understand if people at 2:15 have to leave, but I think the questions are so rich in the Q&A box that we're going to go a little bit longer than 2:15 for those who are able to stay, plus we'll capture those questions in the recording that way. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with a question for Wesley. Actually, I'm going to ask you to respond to it. And it's a basic one that we just have to get out there. And that is, there was a little bit of uncertainty as to what is a hackathon. And just thought before we ask other questions, it would be important for that foundational piece to be a common understanding for everyone.
Of course. And I realized as I was saying it, I was like, oh, I really feel like I should have actually explained this. So I'm really happy this question came up. So a hackathon is usually a large event with a large number of people trying to solve a problem together. Traditionally, hackathons were kind of invented in the tech industry, but there tends to be some like a lot of masculinity and a lot of like, so we really wanted to like spin that on its head and really use it as a way to create ideas together in a space together, have teams and a competition, but not that be the center focus of like what our hackathon was about. But the short definition would be a event, ideation or brainstorming event with a large group of people trying to come to some solutions together.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that's very helpful. And I know many in the audience did understand that, but for many of us, we're not as familiar with that. So thank you very much, Wesley. Diane?
Sure. So a question came in: when you're working with youth who have experienced or who have caused sexual harm, how do you successfully support youth in unlearning dominant cultural norms around sexual violence in their process of taking responsibility? How do you get youth involved and invested in the process?
Great question. We really do that in sort of a deconstructive process, and we use a lot of sort of media. So we might be looking at music lyrics, we might be looking at movies or videos, and really picking apart the ways that rape culture is supported, and to really be doing some thinking about that and challenging them on some of those long-held assumptions and rape myths, for example, that they may hold to. So it's really a bit of a real deconstructive process. I mean, that's sort of the academic word for it, but at a very base level, it's, you know, taking it apart.
Great, thank you.
So back to Wesley and Lee. There was a number of questions that came in that were really interested in language. And you mentioned that it's not necessarily helpful to use certain terms that we might read about in research or whatever, and that you had to think through the language you used in terms of surveys and also in your work with young people. And the question is really, can you share some of that language? Can you help people understand what language was helpful in terms of the work you were doing?
Definitely. So I think that that's a great question. I've dropped some in the Q&A chat as well, but in our development of the survey, we learned from best practices of previous research on descriptions of sexual violence, and in particular, the fact that when you phrase a question in a different way, that people will answer it differently, even if essentially within a definition, it would be the same thing. So for an example, a term like rape versus have you ever had sex when you didn't want to? And so despite the fact that rape is an explicit term for sexual violence, usually it would be something that would be most appropriate for accuracy of language. But in this case, there's twofold reasons to use a more accessible language like this. One is that have you had sex when you didn't want to is something that might be more accessible, for example, for youth who have more than one language in their background. So for whom English is their second language. And so it does necessitate being very specific by what we mean, and that was a priority throughout the survey. But in addition, it is something that has been shown to be much more accurate when we're asking people about the behavior of an intimate partner. So I'll give the example straight off our survey of how our question was phrased. So we said, have you ever had sex when you didn't want to with the person or people you're currently dating, or if you're not currently dating, the person or people you most recently dated? So we're very explicit that sex refers to any sexual behavior, and we list some examples. And then that is a more drawn out version. It's more specific in a way, even though we're not using a term that is as strongly associated in the courts, for example, with sexual violence, so a term like rape. But it does spell it out and make it a little bit harder to avoid acknowledging the fact that if this has happened to you, you know, when it's said in those terms, you might be willing to admit it to yourself, admit it to a survey, rather than you don't want to think in terms of my partner has raped me. Especially this is something that you could see as connecting to other attitudes towards police and other authorities as well. terms like rape are more strongly associated with the authorities, with very official procedures, with charges, and people who are even still with someone who is engaged in sexual violence towards them may not want to think of their partner in those terms, in terms of having committed a crime. And as well, this has the added accuracy of measuring people for whom their idea of an act that's considered criminal, like rape, may be associated with, say, active physical violence, as opposed to saying when you didn't want to, we can also capture the experiences of people for whom other coercive means were used, such as pressuring or emotional manipulation. So
that's very helpful, and I appreciate how concrete you were, because it really brings to life the kinds of choices you made around language and how important they were. Diane?
Sure. So another question came in. They said really interesting work happening at Radius, looking at the risk/protective factors. I'm wondering how the program holistically addresses structural violence, for example, structural racism, colonialism, poverty, which has contributed to the risk factors listed. Is there a responsive approach to the program?
I guess I'll take that question, Kelsey.
Yeah.
I wish we had could fully and wholly address structural violence and end it. That would be the great that would be a great power to have, but we certainly consider it, and we consider it in the lives of the young people that we work with. So right from the very beginning, one section of the assessment is really on assessing for experiences of oppression or marginalization or experiences of structural violence. So that's integrated as a factor in that young person's life when we're doing the assessment. So it's in the assessment report. It's treated as just as much as any other trauma that a young person may experience. And so in that way, although we can't solve the problems of racism and sexism in the world, much as I would like to, we certainly acknowledge it and take that into account as that young person is moving through the program, and acknowledge it as a harm that they've experienced and experience, right? Because it's often ongoing. Did you want to add anything, Kelsey, to that?
Not specifically.
So back to Wesley and Lee. One of the findings you had was, I can't remember the exact stat, but a preference on the part of many young people to reach out and receive support online. And the question then becomes, what do we know about existing supports? To what extent are they online? And maybe during the pandemic that has changed somewhat, but normally or typically, to what extent are services across Canada available online, if that's one of the preferred ways of accessing services or supports, not necessarily in, formal intervention?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in terms of looking for supports that would be appropriate to post with the survey, we did look for what can be, online available to be area specific. So we had things like translifeline.org, kidshelpphone.ca, youthline.ca, as well as Egale has a centrally held list of community resources. Though I'm going to say in a more anecdotal sense, when I was looking to contact different organizations when we were doing snowball sampling for the survey as well, because we did contact organizations and ask them to pass on the information to any other organizations or youth that they knew of who might like to do it. I did find that in my experience, organizations in large cities seem to have more digital setup, more technologically available materials, and not only were there less 2S LGBTQI services available in more rural areas, but also they seem to have less available online and have things that were less updated, for example. So it was harder to see if they had any currently operating resources. Now, I do think that that has probably changed a bit throughout the pandemic as well. It's likely that we see a lot more resources online right now, but certainly one of the issues that I would see as well, one of the drawbacks is that we found in our survey that youth wanted services from 2S LGBTQI people. And even within the services that list explicitly that they are friendly to our community, they don't necessarily state if they have somebody on staff who is part of that community. And in addition, the youth specific ones don't always necessarily even state, that they are friendly to sexual and gender minorities. So I see that as a drawback as well. So I think that was the twofold result from our survey, is both that they want to see resources online, and I would say in terms of the other questions that we weren't able to present today, that they also expressed some dissatisfaction with the resources that are currently available.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Another question says, thanks for these great presentations. Kelsey and Benta, oftentimes programs focused on violence prevention for men and boys experience high levels of attrition/dropout. Have you faced this challenge? And do you have any suggestions or observations on how to keep men and boys engaged in prevention services/support work?
So we worry about that as a challenge. There's no question. In our work with the young people who've committed sexual offenses, a lot of these clients are mandatory clients. So they're referred from youth justice. So we don't have to worry about that attrition or drop off. And even still, once probation is over, very often they're so connected and hooked into our program that they stay on anyways. The average duration for treatment with these guys is about 18 months. Unless it's in the context of a family and we're doing reunification, and then it's usually 2 to 2.5 years. In terms of the youth dating violence program, because it's voluntary participation, we're very new so far. We've lost a couple already, right at the very front end though, before they sort of moved forward with the assessment. But it's certainly a concern. I guess we try with the buy-in is ultimately having good relationships in your life and having healthy relationships with your dating partners or romantic partners down the road can be a bit of a buy-in. They often come with not great history of successful relationships. Kelsey, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, as of right now, we've really only just started the treatment portion and assessment in taking clients into the YDV program. But as Benta said, Radius has a long history of working with young people who have engaged in sexual violence and have charges against them. And so finding creative ways to get them to engage and get that buy-in up front is sort of what is what we do. So absolutely, we're going to lose some, and that's really unfortunate, but sometimes it just means really, really being persistent and, constant reminder texts about the appointment that's coming up tomorrow. And then remember it's later this afternoon, and remember it's in an hour. And sometimes you have to do a little bit more hand-holding. And if that gets them in and gets them starting to do the work.
And they're often coming with a lot of their own pain from their own histories, right? So they're coming in with lots of shame, typically, and that doesn't feel very good when you're carrying that around on a daily basis. So there's also some light at the end of the tunnel, that you can have good relationships, you can feel better about yourself, you can leave that shame behind. So there's some real promises, I think, in terms of after you do the work. Yeah, thanks. Good questions.
Yay. So unfortunately, I think this is how it works. When one of our guests, panelists, answer a question in the Q&A, it only goes to the person who asked it. It doesn't show it to everyone else. So just so that the panelists don't wonder why we're asking questions that have been answered, it's because we want more than the person who asked the question to hear the answer. So on that note, Wesley, I wonder if you could speak to everyone a little bit more about how you were able to incorporate a safe exit on the Qualtrics survey. And I called on you, Wesley, because I knew you were answering that question. We can see that, but we don't see the answer. But I open it up to Lee as well, if there's additional things that you'd like to share.
I'm actually, sorry, I will pass this one to Lee, as they were a larger part of the survey results in that. So I think they'll be able to answer it in a better format than myself.
Yeah, for sure. It's a fairly easy thing to do, and most surveys will have an exit link at the top, essentially, so that you can navigate away from the survey if you choose to do that rather than, say, closing your browser window. Often people who are completing a survey like to have a link like that to have that assurance that, you know, their answers are going to be closed and gone and things like that. Depending on the survey, it might delete your answers when you navigate away from the page in that way. And sometimes people feel more trustful of a link that explicitly says that rather than closing their browser window. However, for us, we did want to ensure that we didn't have any link that led back to us LGBTQI content and so on. So usually, if, for example, if I was putting together a survey that was, you know, for the Canadian Wheat Board or something, if you navigate away from the survey, usually it would take you back to the organization's page. So in this case, we chose Google as a neutral page. And so you could think of it really as a header. If you use Qualtrics is pretty user-friendly. I'm not at all technologically inclined, and I find it easy enough to use. So essentially, you're just embedding a link in text. So it's a hyperlink, and it would show up as click here to leave the survey. And I think that we said actually that it would go to Google, and we have a longer explanation at the start of the survey, stating why we did that and encouraging people to rely on that as a safety feature if someone were to come in that they didn't want to see their answers or didn't want to see the content of the survey. So it's relatively simple to include, and I think that it's just another form of something that's traditionally included in surveys. So I would encourage anyone here, if they're engaging in 2S LGBTQI research, to consider using a neutral link like the way that we did, because really it's even in adults and people who may not be necessarily in the position that many of our youth are living with parents, there's still stigma attached to some identities. There's still people who may not be out in certain places. So it's just another way of respecting their privacy.
Thank you.
So a question, how do you handle confidentiality and duty to report if additional situations are disclosed during the course of treatment?
And I'm gonna, this one is something that we've been sort of struggling to navigate. So Bent, I'm gonna let you
okay.
take that one.
Well, at the front end of the work that we do with anybody is a very, very detailed informed consent around what are the limits to our confidentiality. And clearly within those limits are certainly if anybody under the age of 16 is at risk, there's the mandatory reporting, but it's also if there's someone at risk of imminent harm. So if they've got a partner and they're going to go and bash that partner, then we would intervene. So it's the front end work of it where all of that disclosure is done about what we have to report. Now we're challenged in this work a little bit more because very often the young people we're seeing so far in the program have partners that they've been violent with now, and they're still having contact. And so that gets to be a very dicey area. And we worry about that and struggle with that. But we also know that these are young people that are coming forward on a voluntary basis saying, I want to make changes in my life. And so with that, there's some assurance that, you know, some good faith that they're in a good place.
Thank you.
There was great interest in your, and now forgive me if I have it wrong, but the action committee, the committee that you spoke of invited people to approach you both if they were interested. Could you just talk a little bit more about the committee, a little bit about the role, a little bit about how you may involve, and I don't know if this is the place to include that, but there was also interest in, you mentioned decolonial approaches, and there was interest in what exactly does that mean? It's a word we hear a lot, but when it came to this project, what did that involve? But also how you were thinking as a go forward of involving individuals from Indigenous communities in a way that fits with the ethics and the approaches that we know have been set forward by Indigenous communities for partnering with them.
Yeah, I can speak a bit to that. So I do want to note that when we were speaking about decolonial in approach, that was coming from the youth winning project, the Building Community Understanding Consent, where they were asking for the program to be youth-led, decolonial in approach. We do know that these forms of violence are ongoing and all interconnected to gender-based violence. So I believe, I don't want to speak out of turn, but that is where the youth were coming from. So I do want to note that this committee would be meeting about monthly to bi-weekly, depending on the time of the year and the implementation of the projects. There will be honorariums involved. So we do plan to have 2S, I mean, it is our hope that 2S and QT BIPOC folks and organizations will be working with us on the IAC. And we really hope as well that some of the, some of the 5 organizations that we would be partnering with to implement this pilot program would also be those organizations. So we hope in the forms of, or in the foundations of community engagement, really we need to be building from the very beginning with the community. So I do want to note that that's part of the reason that the IAC is being made and is taking part from now till the end of this project, is that we are having the youth tell us, the knowledge experts, you know, the folks facing this kind of violence, working with them to ensure that the best pilot project is being made.
Thank you, Wesley.
And using their knowledge and like working with their knowledge.
So there's a question, how do you navigate possible internal ethical feelings, for example, frustration, when working with young offenders who may use microaggressions in their treatment? And I think a related question, if it's okay for me to combine them, is do you mind clarifying the difference? I think it was in an early slide, Benta, that you spoke about the difference between ethical responsibility and over-responsibility.
Well, I'll address the one question. Do you want me to take both questions, Kelsey? Or do you want to take the microaggressions part?
Sorry, I'm actively also typing away, answering questions in the chat as well. The microaggressions, a lot of people will often frame that as the young person being manipulative and you know, applying these kind of labels to the behaviors that the young person is engaging in. We really try and look at it as they're trying to get a need met, and they just previously in their life, probably those microaggressions is a way that has worked for them in some capacity or another, and that's why they're continuing to use them. As far as feelings of frustration with a client, I think you can get those feelings of frustration or have those moments with any client, whether they're, you know, somebody who's engaged in violence or a trauma client, like somebody who's been on the victim end of it. I think, you know, as humans or as clinicians, we are only just human. And I think you can always have those moments of frustration, in which case then you can, you know, debrief with your supervisor, take a minute to think where are these feelings coming from and why is it coming up inside me? And it's probably less about the client and more about something that you need to sort of check within yourself.
I'll speak to the responsibility overload piece. So it's really a case of being quite mindful, and it's a bit of a balancing act about, you know, asking young people to take responsibility for the harm and the violence they've done to others, while at the same time acknowledging very often, we'll know after the assessment, the harm and violence that's been done to them. So for example, it's difficult to ask somebody to be empathetic with their partner and care about their partner's feelings if no one has ever demonstrated empathy to them or shown them any empathy in their life growing up. You know, if they've had very rejecting parents or really negative experiences in that way, there hasn't been that learning that, you know, to fill them up with goodness in order they can share goodness outwards. So it's a bit of a balancing act. And it's really, you know, there was a long history of this idea, well, especially working with young people who've sexually harmed, that you got to hold them accountable. You got to put them on the hot seat. You got to tell them you're a sex offender and you're going to be a sex offender forever. And that was the beginning of the work. And that doesn't work, right? The shame doesn't work. And so it's the acknowledging their harm, their pain. And nobody as a young baby or a child says, I want to grow up and be violent with my partner, or I want to grow up and sexually assault somebody. That, you know, they're not in a place they want to be. So going with that knowledge, I think, is also helpful.
Okay, thank you. I think we have reached the point where we need to draw to a close. I just want to share that we had for your presentation well over 700 people joined in and participated, and we still have over 400 with us. And I think it speaks to the interest in these amazing programs that you shared with us today. Thank you to all of you. And I wanted to remind people of the link to the evaluation in the chat, and that your certificate of participation is generated following the completion of that. And I thought, in addition to just saying thank you to Kelsey, to Benta, to Wesley and Lee, and to the Toronto Sign Language Interpretive Service, that I'd like to conclude with a comment out of the Q&A. And it simply says, firstly, I don't have a question. I'm happy to attend this. As a trans individual, I'm so happy to see that sessions like this are being offered to the public. It's something that should be expressed more in the school curriculum, and hopefully in time, with the help of amazing people like you and all the allies, that sessions like this will no longer be needed. We can only hope. Kudos to you all. So with that, again, our thank you, and we'll look forward to connecting with all of you in the future. Bye.